He was a man of immense wealth, whose connections reached into the gilded halls of global power, presidents, princes, titans of industry. Yet Jeffrey Epstein's life ended not in some exotic locale, but alone in a federal jail cell in New York City. The official pronouncement was swift and seemingly straightforward. Suicide. A simple, if tragic, conclusion. But from the instant that word was spoken, a far more complex and troubling question ignited. Was this the truth? Or was it merely the most convenient explanation for a death that many powerful people might have wished for? We will meticulously dissect that official story, piece by piece, confronting every anomaly, every coincidence, every system failure that paved the way to Epstein's final, silent moments. Our journey will ask, what really transpired in cell C22 of the Metropolitan Correctional Center? Our investigation will start by carefully laying out the official version of events, the case for suicide, as presented by the authorities, based on the information they released. We need to understand their findings thoroughly, but then our focus will shift. We'll turn to the other side of the coin, exploring the significant body of evidence that doesn't just question this narrative, but seems to contradict it at fundamental levels. Every piece will be considered, leading us to a carefully reasoned conclusion about why the official story of Jeffrey Epstein's death leaves so much unexplained. To do this, we'll first set the scene, looking closely at the inmate, the institution, and the incredible, almost unbelievable stakes involved. Then, we'll build the official case for suicide, exploring the determinations of multiple federal agencies, the forensic evidence they cited, and the psychological factors that purportedly support that conclusion. After that, we'll present the counter-narrative, diving deep into the anomalous forensic findings, the catastrophic institutional failures, and the tangled web of suspicious circumstances that challenge the official story. We'll put these arguments side by side, and finally, we'll deliver our conclusion, a rigorous argument explaining why the official finding of an unassisted suicide simply doesn't hold up under scrutiny. Before we dive into the evidence, it's absolutely crucial to understand the environment. This story doesn't unfold in a vacuum. It happens in a specific place, to a specific person, under extraordinary circumstances that set this case apart from any other. You see, Jeffrey Epstein wasn't incarcerated in some modern, well-managed or secure facility. He was held at the Metropolitan Correctional Center, MCC, New York, an institution notorious, even infamous, for its severe disrepair and operational chaos. And every crumbling wall, every overstretched officer, every faulty lock we're about to describe wasn't just a sign of a failing institution. It was a potential crack in the system, a vulnerability that, in Epstein's case, could prove fatal, or perhaps deliberately exploitable. These weren't just isolated slip-ups we're talking about. They were symptoms of a deep systemic rot. For years, MCC New York had been crippled by chronic staffing shortages, a constant lack of personnel that often meant existing correctional officers were forced into exhausting mandatory overtime just to meet bare minimum staffing. On the night of Epstein's death, this problem wasn't just evident, it was glaring. Officer Tova Knoll, for instance, was working a mandatory overtime shift, her second 8-hour shift of that day. Her partner, Officer Michael Thomas, whose regular role was as a materials handler supervisor, was also pulling an overtime shift as a correctional officer. Investigations suggest he might have been on his 5th consecutive day of such mandatory overtime. Imagine the fatigue, the diminished alertness. A union representative bluntly described staffing levels at MCC as completely inadequate, leading to officers being overwhelmed and critically not alert. This environment of acute decay was also chillingly physical. MCC New York was an aging facility plagued by what official reports themselves called critical disrepair and failing physical infrastructure. We're talking about documented crumbling exterior walls, damaged cells, faulty and overflowing plumbing leading to persistent sewage leaks, and infestations of rats and vermin. Rats and vermin. Sewage leaks. Officers working 16-hour shifts. Is this truly the environment to house one of the nation's most sensitive inmates? The question seems to answer itself, and within this crumbling institution, the very eyes meant to watch over its most high-profile inmate, the security cameras, held their own dark secret. It wasn't just that the system was old, it's that specific cameras, in specific locations, at specific crucial times, simply weren't recording. This pattern of electronic blindness, particularly on Epstein's tier, isn't just a footnote in the MCC's litany of failures. It's a chilling enigma we'll be forced to confront as we dig deeper into what happened, or what was allowed to happen, in those final hours. A particularly critical aspect of MCC's operational failure, as we now know, was its chronically deficient security camera system. The Department of Justice Office of the Inspector General, the OIG, pointed to long-standing deficiencies with the camera setup. Most disturbingly, from late July 2019, specifically July 29th, and continuing right through the date of Epstein's death, nearly all security cameras located in and around the Special Housing Unit tier where Epstein was housed were not recording video. While the cameras still broadcast live feeds to monitoring stations, a severe technical malfunction with the digital video recorder, or DVR, system stopped any footage from being saved. MCC personnel reportedly discovered this critical recording failure on August 8, 2019, just 2 days before Epstein died. Yet, incredibly, the system wasn't fixed until after his demise. Despite being, in the OIG report's own words, arguably one of the most notorious inmates in BOP's custody, Epstein's actual supervision was, to put it mildly, shockingly negligent. Weeks before his death, on July 23, 2019, he was found in his cell, semi-conscious, with a strip of orange cloth around his neck. His cellmate at the time, a former police officer named Nicholas Tartaglione, alerted officers, claiming Epstein had tried to hang himself. Yet, what truly happened in that July 23rd incident remains shrouded in ambiguity and fierce dispute. Epstein himself reportedly gave conflicting stories, initially telling staff he believed Tartaglione had tried to kill him. An attorney who met with Epstein afterward recounted that Epstein denied any suicide attempt, dismissing it as a bizarre prank by his physically imposing cellmate that he didn't resist for fear of being labelled a rat. Adding another layer of obscurity to this already murky event is the confirmed loss of surveillance video footage from outside Epstein's cell during this critical period. It was reported as unusable, or, more unsettlingly, having been inadvertently deleted. Following this incident, the MCC Psychology Department issued a formal, explicit directive. Epstein needed to be housed with an appropriate cellmate. This order was emailed to over 70 MCC staff members, a clear instruction. Yet, despite this, on August 9th, the day before his death, Epstein's cellmate was transferred out of the facility, and MCC staff did absolutely nothing to assign him a new one. He was left deliberately isolated, in direct violation of a psychological and safety protocol. And on duty that night, responsible for the direct observation of Jeffrey Epstein, were correctional officers Tova Noel and Michael Thomas. Two names that would soon become synonymous not with diligence, but with a dereliction of duty so profound, so complete, it almost defies belief. What truly happened on their watch, and the lengths they allegedly went to obscure it, isn't just a sidebar to this story. It's a gaping hole right at its centre, a void of accountability we are compelled to explore. Finally, Epstein's death wasn't like that of an ordinary inmate because he was an extremely sensitive prisoner whose continued existence posed an immense, almost existential threat to a vast network of powerful and influential people across the globe. This context creates an extraordinary and widespread motive for foul play that simply cannot and should not be credibly overlooked. His federal sex trafficking charges meant his upcoming trial held the terrifying potential for him to implicate numerous high-profile associates from his infamous Black Book, a list that allegedly included former presidents, royalty, and titans of business and finance. A critical and acute stressor, or perhaps a trigger, occurred on August 9th, 2019, the very day before his death. On this date, a federal court ordered the unsealing of over 2,000 pages of documents related to a civil lawsuit. These documents contained, quote, brutal details about Epstein's extensive sex trafficking operations, including sworn testimony naming numerous powerful individuals he allegedly directed his victims to have sex with. The release of these records guaranteed even more intense media scrutiny and public implication of his associates, significantly, almost desperately, ratcheting up the motive for any implicated parties to ensure his permanent silence. His death certainly ended that immediate legal threat. But before that silence fell, Epstein himself made one final peculiar communication, a cryptic phone call that offers a chilling alternative glimpse into his state of mind, a call we will dissect. With that unsettling context established, let's first walk through the official version of events, the case for suicide, as presented by the authorities based on the information they released. We need to understand their findings thoroughly. The official conclusion rests on the findings of these three key investigative bodies: the New York City Medical Examiner, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the Department of Justice. Each conducted its own inquiry, and all arrived at conclusions that were, on the surface, congruent regarding the manner of death. Following an autopsy on August 11, 2019, New York City's Chief Medical Examiner, Dr. Barbara Sampson, officially announced her determination on August 16th. The cause of Epstein's death was hanging, and the manner of death was suicide. She consistently stood by this ruling, stating, "Our investigation concluded that the cause of Mr. Epstein's death was hanging, and the manner of death was suicide. We stand by that determination." One federal agency independently supported this. The FBI conducted an inquiry focused specifically on determining if any criminality was involved, and concluded that there was no criminality pertaining to how Epstein had died. The Department of Justice Office of the Inspector General, or OIG, launched its own investigation, primarily looking at the conduct of Bureau of Prisons personnel. While the OIG's comprehensive report detailed numerous and serious failures by MCC New York staff, it explicitly stated that its investigation did not uncover evidence contradicting the FBI's determination regarding the absence of criminality in connection with how Epstein died. Dusra. The forensic pathological evidence, when viewed alongside established principles, is said to offer a coherent and scientifically grounded basis for the suicide ruling. The medical examiner's findings noted that Epstein presented with a marked and obvious ligature furrow that peaked upward, which is consistent with suicide as opposed to a ligature strangulation. This upward-pointing V-shape is a classic indicator of hanging, showing the point of suspension against gravity. Furthermore, the furrow was described as too broad to have been caused by the electrical cord of the medical device in Epstein's cell, suggesting it was consistent with a wider, softer ligature, like a torn bedsheet, the alleged instrument of his death. But even this seemingly straightforward detail of a bedsheet noose would later be thrown into chaos by a single, inexplicable observation about its condition. That crucial discrepancy is something we must hold on to. The medical examiner's findings included a detail that, on its surface, seemed to support the suicide ruling. Fractures to Epstein's hyoid bone and thyroid cartilage, not uncommon, they said, in hangings of older individuals. Yet buried within that assessment was a particularity about these breaks, their number, their nature, that would soon be seized upon by another expert eye. This wasn't just a fracture. It was a specific pattern of fractures that, according to this expert, told a story far more violent and far less straightforward than a simple suicide. The truth held within those tiny bones is something we will have to carefully exhume. The medical examiner also reported no strap muscle hemorrhages, typically, though not always, indicative of a struggle. The petechial hemorrhages, small pinpoint marks on his face, were deemed consistent with suicide by hanging, a finding that, like others, would soon face scrutiny. But on paper, for the official report, these details built a cohesive picture. Critically, there was a noticeable lack of any injuries that would indicate a struggle. The medical examiner explicitly told the OIG that there was no evidence of defensive wounds that would be expected if his death had been a homicide. The OIG report elaborates, Epstein did not have marks on his hands, broken fingernails or debris under them, contusions to his knuckles that would have evidenced a fight, or bruising on his body. Finally, blood toxicology tests were profoundly significant, as they did not reveal any medications or illegal substances in Epstein's system. This negative finding effectively rules out the possibility that Epstein was incapacitated by drugs, which would have been a likely way to facilitate a homicide stage to look like a suicide. Evidence from the death scene and the surrounding circumstances is also presented as providing significant corroboration. A search of Epstein's cell revealed he had an excess of prison blankets, linens, and clothing in his cell, and that some had been ripped to create nooses. The OIG specifically noted that numerous nooses made from prison bed sheets were found in his cell. The presence of multiple pre-fashioned nooses strongly suggests preparation and a deliberate plan to use available materials for self-harm. According to testimony from MCC personnel, Epstein was found suspended from the top portion of the bunk bed in a near-seated position, with his legs extended out in front of him. This is entirely consistent with a recognized and frequently used method of suicidal partial hanging, which doesn't require complete free body suspension to be lethal. The weight of the head alone can be enough to cause death. Crucially, investigations found no evidence of forced entry into Epstein's locked cell. Furthermore, the one functioning surveillance camera that recorded footage of the common area showed no one was seen entering Epstein's cell tier between approximately 10:40 p.m. on August 9th and 6:30 a.m. on August 10th, although, as we know, direct security footage of Epstein's floor was conveniently unavailable. Finally, several psychological and behavioral factors are cited to provide a compelling context that aligns with the official determination of suicide. On July 23, 2019, about 2.5 weeks before his death, Epstein was found in his cell with an orange cloth ligature around his neck in a semi-conscious state. According to his cellmate at the time, Epstein had attempted to hang himself. A prior suicide attempt is one of the most significant risk factors for a completed suicide. In the period leading up to his death, Epstein was also facing an overwhelming combination of severe life stressors: federal charges for sex trafficking of minors carrying a potential sentence of up to 45 years, effectively life imprisonment, denial of bail, meaning indefinite pretrial detention in the highly restrictive special housing unit, an immediate and catastrophic loss of public status, and the looming threat of potential financial ruin. A critical acute stressor occurred on August 9th, 2019, the day immediately preceding his death, when a federal court ordered the unsealing of over 2,000 pages of documents containing brutal details about his extensive sex trafficking operations. And just 2 days before his death, on August 8th, Epstein signed a new last will and testament, an act of putting one's affairs in order that is often recognized as a behavioral indicator of someone planning suicide. On the surface, the official story might appear coherent, yet beneath that veneer lies a troubling landscape of inconsistencies, glaring anomalies, and circumstances so improbable they strain credulity to its breaking point. Prepare to question everything you've just heard as we now delve into the powerful evidence suggesting Jeffrey Epstein was silenced. Evidence that screams he did not take his own life. The very foundation of the official suicide conclusion, the autopsy, a procedure meant to provide definitive answers, instead became a focal point of intense debate, largely thanks to the unsettling observations of veteran forensic pathologist Dr. Michael Barden. He was retained by Epstein's brother to personally observe the autopsy, and what he witnessed points to a starkly different conclusion, beginning with the very bones in Epstein's neck. Specifically, not one, but 3 distinct fractures. 2 bilateral fractures of the thyroid cartilage, the Adam's apple, and a fracture of the left hyoid bone. Dr. Barden, drawing on his decades of experience encompassing thousands of cases, stated unequivocally, "I have never seen 3 fractures like this in a suicidal hanging." He elaborated, "Going over 1,000 jail hangings, suicides in the New York City state prisons over the past 40 to 50 years, no one had 3 fractures." He characterized these injuries as extremely unusual in suicidal hangings and could occur much more commonly in homicidal strangulation, explaining that the focused, direct pressure exerted during a homicidal strangulation could be double or even triple that of a typical less localized hanging. This direct, specific challenge based on extensive experience directly refutes the generalized assertion that such fractures can occur in suicides by highlighting the extreme rarity and suspicious nature of this particular combination of 3 distinct fractures, especially in a partial suspension scenario. While Chief Medical Examiner Dr. Barbara Sampson maintained her office's conclusion, her public responses did not specifically refute Dr. Barden's point about the unique pattern of 3 such fractures, nor fully detail the specific forensic reasoning that led the performing pathologist to change an initial pending manner of death to suicide, reportedly after considering non-forensic additional evidence, like the ambiguous prior alleged suicide attempt. Beyond the fractures, a constellation of other injuries paints a picture potentially indicative of a violent struggle, not a passive suicide. The autopsy noted contusions on both of Epstein's wrists, consistent with restraint or fending off an attacker, an abrasion on his left forearm, an injury to the back of his neck, a cut on his lip, an injection mark in his arm, though its significance remains debated, and, significantly, deep muscle hemorrhaging in his left shoulder muscle. Dr. Baden highlighted that the prominent hemorrhage in the soft tissues of the neck Next to the fractures is evidence of a fresh neck compression that could have caused the death. 5. The wrist contusions and the deep shoulder hemorrhaging are particularly difficult to reconcile with the typical unassisted hanging, where such focal trauma would be unexpected. How do these fit the narrative of an unassisted suicide, or do they perhaps point elsewhere? If the injuries on the body are disturbing, then the alleged instrument of death, the ligature, presents a puzzle piece so ill-fitting it threatens to shatter the entire official picture. We're told it was a strip of orange bedsheet. Yet, when we examine the photographic evidence, a detail emerges that is not just contradictory, but defies the sworn account of how Epstein was found. Both ends of the noose collected as evidence were folded and hemmed, not cut. This is a fundamental problem, as the guard who discovered Epstein reportedly cut him down. If the ligature was cut, how could the ends in evidence be neatly hemmed? This detail doesn't just suggest a mistake, it actively undermines the credibility of the primary eyewitness accounts of the discovery and hints at evidence tampering or the introduction of a pre-prepared ligature. The choice of ligature is also puzzling. Epstein had access to wires and cords from a sleep apnea machine, arguably stronger and more readily available means for self-harm, yet a flimsy bedsheet was supposedly used. Perhaps most critically, the results of any DNA analysis performed on the ligature, which Dr. Barden noted would be all over the ligature, potentially identifying who handled it, have never been made public. This withholding of crucial forensic data creates an information vacuum where answers should be, fueling suspicions of a deliberate cover-up. This entire forensic picture is further obscured by a catastrophic procedural failure. No photographs were taken of Jeffrey Epstein's body as it was found in his cell. This is a direct violation of Bureau of Prisons protocol, which mandates treating a suicide scene with the same level of protection as any crime scene, and it represents an irretrievable loss of primary evidence, making independent verification of the body's position, the ligature's true placement, and blood pooling patterns impossible, forcing an untenable reliance on the accounts of guards already facing criminal charges for their conduct that night. The questions raised by the forensic evidence are profound, painting a picture inconsistent with a simple suicide. But these anomalies didn't occur in an ideal environment. They occurred within the deeply flawed walls of MCC New York. To understand if the scene could have been manipulated, or if an unobserved event was even possible, we must now confront the staggering reality of the institutional failures that plagued Epstein's incarceration. Failures so perfectly aligned with his demise, they beg the question of design over dysfunction. We spoke earlier of Officers Noel and Thomas, tasked with Epstein's care. Now we confront the stark reality of their conduct. Their complete abdication of duty wasn't just a lapse, it was an 8-hour window of opportunity, compounded by what investigators would later uncover as deliberate criminal deception. For roughly 8 consecutive hours, they failed to conduct any of the required 30-minute rounds to check on inmates. Surveillance footage reportedly showed them sleeping for a period exceeding 2 hours, and, at other times, browsed the internet for furniture and motorcycle sales. To cover this up, Noel and Thomas then deliberately and repeatedly falsified official count slips and round sheets, fraudulently claiming they had performed the required checks. This was not just negligence, it was an act of active criminal deception for which they were federally charged, though those charges were later dismissed under a deferred prosecution agreement. This dereliction occurred at the precise moment Epstein, having been inexplicably stripped of his cellmate against explicit psychological recommendations just the day before, was at his most vulnerable and unobserved. The MCC Psychology Department had issued an explicit directive, emailed to over 70 staff members, that Epstein needed to be housed with an appropriate cellmate. Yet on August 9th, the day before his death, his cellmate was transferred out, and MCC staff took no action whatsoever to assign a new one, leaving him completely alone. It is the convergence of these specific failures, the guards abandoning their posts and falsifying records, Epstein's mandated cellmate being removed, all happening simultaneously, that transforms simple negligence into a situation ripe for exploitation. Now remember the questions we raised earlier about the surveillance system at MCC? This is where those long-standing deficiencies move from being a general concern to a very specific and highly convenient problem in the Epstein case. Was it merely bad luck, or something far more calculated? The official explanation of catastrophic disk failures silencing precisely those cameras crucial to observing Epstein's tear for precisely that critical time frame, and this failure going unremedied despite discovery days before his death, asks us to accept a level of coincidence that defies all probability. Not just one camera, but several, each with a seemingly distinct problem, yet all contributing to the same outcome, an almost complete inability to verify what happened on Epstein's tear. Coincidence, or a pattern emerging from the chaos? And when this technical misfortune is echoed by the conveniently unusable or deleted footage from Epstein's first alleged suicide attempt, a disturbing pattern indeed begins to emerge, a pattern not of random malfunctions, but perhaps of targeted blindness. More specifically to Epstein's situation, a critical digital video recorder, or DVR, system malfunction began on July 29, 2019. This particular malfunction resulted in nearly all of the security cameras located in and around Epstein's specific special housing unit tier ceasing to record video, although they continued to broadcast live feeds. MCC New York personnel reportedly only discovered this critical recording failure on August 8, 2019, a mere 2 days before Epstein's death, yet the system remained unrepaired until after he died. The FBI's forensic analysis attributed this DVR failure to catastrophic disk failures. Despite this official technical explanation, the timing of this prolonged outage, lasting nearly 2 weeks, and affecting multiple cameras in a high-security unit, is inherently suspicious. This pattern of conveniently failing or missing footage at every critical juncture related to Epstein's safety effectively created a cone of silence and invisibility around him, eliminating any objective record and forcing reliance on compromised testimonies. So now we have a scene with no reliable eyewitnesses due to dereliction of duty and falsified records, and no reliable electronic eyes due to a cascade of convenient technical malfunctions. The official narrative of an unassisted suicide in such a compromised environment becomes not just questionable, but profoundly difficult to accept. And the picture only grows more complex when we consider Epstein's own reported state of mind and actions in his final days. Finally, a host of circumstances and Epstein's own behaviors paint a picture fundamentally at odds with a man resolved on unassisted suicide, directly contradicting the profile often cited to support the official ruling. He possessed information that could ruin a global network of powerful people, providing a widespread and compelling motive for his silencing. This motive was acutely amplified on August 9th, the day before his death, when a court unsealed over 2,000 pages of documents with brutal details of his crimes, implicating numerous powerful figures. His behavior, however, was that of a man actively fighting and planning for the future. Federal prosecutors had already accused him of attempting to obstruct justice by making payments totaling $350,000 to two potential witnesses just months earlier. Reports he was directing money to other inmates for protection strongly suggest he felt threatened and feared for his life, behavior antithetical to someone planning their own imminent demise, contradicting the idea of a man lost in despair. Multiple lawyers, including David Schoen, who met with him on August 1st, described him as being upbeat and actively engaged in his defense strategy only days and hours before his death. Just 2 days before his death, he executed a new will, placing his $577 million estate into a secret trust. While often a sign of suicide in Epstein's context, with known threats and his methodical nature, it can equally be interpreted as organizing affairs due to external dangers or ensuring his complex estate was managed as he wished, not necessarily as a prelude to self-destruction. And then there's that final, baffling phone call we alluded to earlier, a 21-minute unmonitored conversation to Belarus on that final evening, staff violating policy to allow it, a call he arranged by falsely claiming he was phoning his deceased mother. His reported words, "They are trying to keep me safe," and an assurance he wouldn't call again for a month. Listen to those phrases again. Are these the words of a man about to end his life? Or do they paint a picture of someone entangled in circumstances, perhaps threats or assurances, entirely alien to a suicidal mindset? The confluence of the document unsealing, heightening motive for others, the inexplicable removal of his cellmate, creating opportunity, the unmonitored call suggesting external communication, and his death within a 24-hour window is not just striking. It presents a sequence of events so perfectly aligned to facilitate an unobserved death under heightened external pressure that to label it mere coincidence asks the listener to suspend disbelief entirely. So, having explored both the official narrative supporting suicide and the powerful counter-narrative suggesting otherwise, how do these arguments really stack up when directly compared? Let's meticulously weigh the key claims based on the weight of the evidence presented. First, the question of the autopsy itself. Was it a definitive finding or a premature judgment? The pro-suicide argument emphasizes the convergence of findings from official bodies. However, the anti-suicide claim introduces significant doubt regarding the ME's process, transparency, and lack of specific rebuttal to Dr. Baden's precise claims. While official convergence is usually persuasive, the depth of specific unanswered questions means the anti-suicide arguments establish a more compelling case for profound skepticism regarding the definitive accuracy of that official determination. Second, we examine the forensic pathological evidence. The official narrative points to generalized indicators of hanging. But the anti-suicide case, spearheaded by Dr. Baden's specific challenge to the unique three-fracture pattern, the glaring contradiction of the hemmed not cut ligature, the lack of public DNA results, and other unexplained injuries, all compounded by the irretrievable loss of scene photography, presents a pattern of anomalies far more indicative of something beyond a typical, unassisted hanging. Thus, on the critical issue of forensic pathology, the specific unanswered anomalies presented by the anti-suicide case leave the official explanation deeply wanting. Third, let's consider the scene and circumstantial evidence. The pro-suicide argument notes improvised nooses and no forced entry. The anti-suicide arguments, however, highlight the profound ligature anomalies and, more critically, the overwhelmingly suspicious and convenient timing of the near-total camera recording failure. This, coupled with the irrevocably compromised scene due to the lack of in-situ photography, makes the anti-suicide claim that the environment was ripe for an unobserved event, potentially foul play, significantly more convincing than explanations resting on incomplete surveillance. Fourth, we evaluate the psychological and behavioral factors. The pro-suicide narrative emphasizes stressors and prior alleged attempts. Yet, the anti-suicide arguments present a compelling array of direct behavioral contradictions. Epstein's upbeat demeanor, his active legal fight, payments for protection, and the utterly bizarre Belarus call with its future-oriented statements. Here, the weight of specific contradictory behaviors simply overwhelms generalized stress factors as indicators of imminent, unassisted suicide. Finally, we analyze whether the systemic deficiencies at MCC New York merely provided an opportunity for suicide or were indicative of something more. The pro-suicide argument suggests gross negligence created an opportunity without criminality in the death itself. The anti-suicide argument, however, posits that the sheer number, scale, and precise, convenient timing of all critical failures converging on Epstein — no cellmate, no rounds, actively falsified logs, non-recording cameras, compromised scene — strains credulity as mere coincidence. The guard's active deception implies more than passive negligence. Therefore, the totality and nature of these failures make the anti-suicide interpretation that this was an environment where foul play could be easily facilitated and obscured the far more logical and compelling conclusion. In summary, while individual points from the official narrative hold some weight, the anti-suicide arguments consistently present specific, material inconsistencies and unanswered questions across forensic, institutional, and behavioral domains. The official narrative often relies on generalities or explanations of simple incompetence, which become increasingly difficult to accept when faced with the overwhelming confluence of suspicious circumstances. The official determination by the New York City chief medical examiner that Jeffrey Epstein died by unassisted suicide by hanging on August 10, 2019, while consistently affirmed by various governmental agencies, fundamentally fails to withstand rigorous scrutiny when confronted with the totality of the available evidence. This final treatise will systematically dismantle the official narrative, exposing a compelling array of forensic anomalies, unprecedented institutional failures, and a nexus of suspicious circumstances that collectively render the conclusion of unassisted suicide highly improbable and, indeed, untenable. The pervasive skepticism surrounding Epstein's death is not grounded in speculative theories, but in a meticulous evidence-based assessment of facts gleaned from official reports, expert testimonies, investigative journalism, and the inherent contradictions within the established timeline of events. The core assertion here is unequivocal. Jeffrey Epstein did not commit suicide. This position is not merely a contention against the official ruling. It is a meticulously constructed argument, rooted in a comprehensive analysis of all available credible information, which demonstrates that the official determination of unassisted suicide is fundamentally inadequate, internally inconsistent, and profoundly insufficient to account for the totality of the evidence. To rigorously evaluate the official determination, it is crucial to first re-establish the foundational understanding of the environment in which Jeffrey Epstein was detained, the events immediately preceding his death, and the extraordinary motivations at play. The previously established state of severe disrepair and staffing chaos at MCC directly undermines the notion of a secure environment where a simple suicide could be the only plausible event. Jeffrey Epstein's incarceration at MCC New York was not in a well-managed or secure facility. Instead, it was in an institution widely recognized as being in a state of severe disrepair and operational disarray. MCC New York suffered from deep-rooted and persistent staffing shortages that had plagued the Bureau of Prisons system for years leading up to 2019. These chronic deficits frequently necessitated mandatory overtime for existing correctional officers. For example, Officer Michael Thomas, one of the 2 officers assigned to the Special Housing Unit where Epstein was housed on the night he died, was working an overtime shift despite his regular role as a materials handler supervisor, possibly on his 5th consecutive day of mandatory overtime. Similarly, Officer Tova Noel was also working a mandatory overtime shift, her second 8-hour shift of the day. Such conditions inevitably lead to severe staff fatigue and diminished vigilance. A union representative described staffing at MCC as completely inadequate, leading to officers being overwhelmed and not alert. The facility itself was an aging structure suffering from critical disrepair and failing physical infrastructure, with reports documenting crumbling exterior walls, damaged cells, faulty plumbing, persistent sewage leaks, unreliable electrical systems, and malfunctioning life safety equipment. It was notorious for unsanitary conditions, including infestations of rats and vermin, mold growth, and a lack of natural light. The official narrative then expects us to believe that his death occurred in an informational black hole, conveniently created by the simultaneous failure of nearly all security cameras on his specific tier, a blindness that persisted despite prior discovery. The OIG described long-standing deficiencies with its camera infrastructure. Most alarmingly, from late July 2019, specifically beginning on July 29, 2019, and continuing through the date of Epstein's death, nearly all of the security cameras located in and around the SU tier where Epstein was housed were not recording video due to a severe technical malfunction with the digital video recorder system. MCC New York personnel reportedly discovered this critical recording failure on August 8, 2019, just 2 days before Epstein's death, but the system remained unrepaired until after his demise. While one camera in the SHU common area was operational, its field of view did not capture Epstein's cell door directly. Furthermore, video footage from a camera positioned outside Epstein's cell during his first alleged suicide attempt on July 23, 2019, was also reported as unusable or having been inadvertently deleted by MCC staff. The OIG report also stated that the types of management failures and widespread disregard of BOP policies observed were issues the OIG had frequently encountered in prior oversight work, suggesting a pre-existing culture where procedural adherence was lax and misconduct, including the falsification of records, was a known issue. Despite his extraordinary profile, the severity of his charges, and a recent incident that should have triggered heightened vigilance, Epstein's actual conditions of detention and supervision at MCC New York were marked by profound negligence. Approximately 2.5 weeks before his death, on July 23, 2019, Epstein was found in his cell in a semi-conscious state with a strip of orange cloth around his neck. His then cellmate Nicholas Tartaglione reportedly alerted correctional officers that Epstein had attempted to hang himself. However, Epstein himself reportedly gave conflicting accounts, initially telling MCC staff that he believed Tartaglione had tried to kill him, and later, according to attorney David Schoen, denying any suicide attempt and claiming Tartaglione had placed a rope around his neck in a bizarre prank. This critical ambiguity is compounded by the confirmed loss of surveillance video footage from outside Epstein's cell during this event. Following this July 23rd incident, the MCC Psychology Department explicitly determined that he needed to be housed with an appropriate cellmate, a directive formally communicated via email to over 70 MCC staff members. Despite this clear mandate, on August 9, 2019, the day before his death, Epstein's cellmate was transferred out, and MCC staff, despite advance notification from the US Marshals Service, took no action whatsoever to assign him a new one, leaving him deliberately isolated. Jeffrey Epstein's death was not that of an ordinary inmate. He was a highly sensitive prisoner whose continued existence posed a monumental threat to a vast network of powerful and influential individuals across the globe. His arrest on federal sex trafficking charges meant that his impending trial carried the profound potential for him to testify or to implicate numerous high-profile associates, including former US presidents, members of royal families, and titans of business and finance. On August 9, 2019, the day immediately preceding Epstein's death, a federal court ordered the unsealing of over 2,000 pages of documents related to a settled defamation lawsuit containing brutal details about Epstein's sex trafficking operations and naming numerous powerful individuals. This development significantly amplified the motive for any implicated parties to ensure his silence. The forensic evidence from the autopsy, far from conclusively supporting suicide, presents highly atypical patterns that demand reconsideration. Dr. Michael Baden's expert observation of 3 distinct neck fractures, specifically bilateral thyroid cartilage fractures, in addition to a hyoid bone fracture, is a critical anomaly. His professional experience of never encountering such a combination in thousands of suicidal hangings directly challenges the official interpretation that these injuries were consistent with self-inflicted hanging. He asserted these injuries are extremely unusual in suicidal hangings and could occur much more commonly in homicidal strangulation. 6. The additional unexplained injuries such as contusions on both wrists and significant deep muscle hemorrhaging in the left shoulder further complicate a narrative of a passive, unresisted hanging. Crucially, the material inconsistency of the ligature itself, photographed with ends that were folded and hemmed, not cut, directly contradicting the claim it was cut down, and the absence of publicly reported DNA analysis results from this critical piece of evidence undermine the very foundation of the hanging conclusion. The choice of ligature is also puzzling when other, potentially stronger, materials like sleep apnea machine cords were present. While negative toxicology ruled out chemical incapacitation, this alone does not preclude other forms of foul play, particularly if untraceable substances were used or if the attack was swift and overwhelming. The official emphasis on the absence of defensive wounds is not conclusive proof against homicide, especially if an attack were overwhelming or involved surprise, and other injuries like wrist contusions could indeed suggest a struggle against restraint. And who was watching? No one. The 2 officers assigned to him not only abdicated their most basic duties for 8 consecutive hours, but then actively conspired to deceive investigators by falsifying records, actions that scream of something far more sinister than simple fatigue. The environment of profound and suspicious institutional failure at the Metropolitan Correctional Center on the night of Epstein's death was not merely lax, it was a catastrophically compromised environment where the normal checks and balances utterly collapsed specifically around him. The DOJ-OIG's detailed report lays bare a perfect storm of security breaches and active misconduct that converged precisely on Epstein. The deliberate violation of the clear directive to house Epstein with a cellmate left him intentionally isolated. The prolonged and conveniently timed malfunction of nearly all surveillance cameras in Epstein's SU tier, a failure attributed by the FBI to catastrophic disk failures, yet allowed to persist unaddressed for weeks leading up to and including his death, created a critical, unrecorded blind spot precisely when an unobserved act was necessary. This, compounded by the prior unusable footage from the July 23rd incident, suggests a pattern rather than isolated technical faults. The egregious violation of death scene protocol by removing Epstein's body before in situ photography irrevocably destroyed crucial primary evidence, preventing any independent verification of how he was actually found and actively obscuring the truth. This comprehensive breakdown of institutional controls, coupled with active concealment and suspiciously convenient technical failures, demonstrably created an environment perfectly suited for an unobserved death to occur and its true nature to be systematically obscured. Epstein's actions and the events immediately preceding his death sharply contradict the psychological profile of a man definitively resolved on unassisted suicide. His upbeat demeanor and active engagement in legal strategy, reported by his lawyers just hours and days before his death, are fundamentally inconsistent with a sudden, despair-driven suicide. The highly irregular, unmonitored 21-minute phone call to an unidentified individual in Belarus, made under the false pretense of calling his deceased mother hours before his death, with cryptic statements about being kept safe and not being able to call again for another month, is deeply suspicious and points towards clandestine communication related to external factors or threats, not a farewell from a man about to take his own life. His 11th hour execution of a new will on August 8th, transferring his vast estate of over $577 million into a secret trust, while noted by some as a suicide indicator, can equally, if not more plausibly in this context, be interpreted as safeguarding his wealth from forfeiture, or controlling its disposition due to perceived external threats or a long-term strategy, rather than a final act of resignation. MCC officials were reportedly unaware of this will change as a red flag. His reported fears for his safety and alleged payments to other inmates for protection indicate a perception of external threat, not internal despair. Prior allegations by prosecutors that he made substantial payments totaling $350,000 to potential witnesses also suggest a man actively fighting the charges, not surrendering to them. The unresolved ambiguity of the July 23rd incident, compounded by missing video, renders it unreliable as definitive proof of prior suicidal intent, and could even be interpreted as a failed assault or a staged event. The strength of the argument against unassisted suicide lies not in any single smoking gun, but in the powerful cumulative effect of these disparate yet interconnected factors. It is the sheer improbability of such a unique and contested set of forensic markers appearing coincidentally with such a catastrophic, multi-layered, and conveniently timed breakdown of security protocols and surveillance for this specific, uniquely high-value inmate, an individual who possessed information potentially ruinous to a global network of powerful people, that renders the official narrative implausible. The assertion that Jeffrey Epstein's death was a mere suicide by hanging, facilitated solely by general institutional incompetence, strains credulity to its breaking point. The pervasive system failures at MCC were not merely passive, They involved active deception and the convenient disabling of crucial surveillance. This created an environment not just of negligence, but one ripe for manipulation, exploitation, and, most chillingly, for a homicide to be committed or an assisted suicide to be orchestrated and subsequently covered up. Based on the meticulously detailed forensic inconsistencies, the overwhelming evidence of gross and strategically convenient institutional failures, and the compelling array of suspicious circumstantial factors and contradictory behaviors, this treatise asserts with rigorous conviction that Jeffrey Epstein did not kill himself. The official conclusion of suicide is not adequately supported by the totality of the evidence. It fails to account for too many material facts, specific anomalies, and profound irregularities. The victims of Jeffrey Epstein's heinous crimes, who were denied the opportunity to see him face full justice in court, and the wider public, who have a vested interest in the integrity of the justice system and the security of its federal institutions, deserve a complete, credible, and transparent accounting of his death. The persistent questions that erode trust in the official findings cannot be ignored. The evidence, as we've laid it out, doesn't just whisper of doubt, it roars with unanswered questions. Therefore, only a renewed, truly independent and fully empowered investigation, one that dares to look beyond the convenient explanation, is mandated to re-examine all forensic evidence, secure and analyze all previously withheld records, including full DNA results from the ligature and all, available, albeit limited, surveillance data, thoroughly investigate all plausible scenarios including assisted suicide and homicide without premature deference to previous conclusions, and formally interview all relevant witnesses including those with dissenting views under oath, can ever hope to uncover the full truth behind Jeffrey Epstein's final hours, and perhaps begin to restore the shattered public trust in the very systems meant to deliver justice. We've meticulously dismantled the official narrative, exposing inconsistencies and implausibilities that make an unassisted suicide conclusion untenable. But if Jeffrey Epstein didn't kill himself, if the official story is indeed a carefully constructed facade, then how could such a sophisticated plot have been executed within the supposedly secure confines of the Metropolitan Correctional Center on August 10th, 2019? The question itself is chilling, and it demands exploration. The pervasive skepticism, as we've argued, isn't mere speculation. It is born from an evidence-based assessment of fact. And when we consider the totality of those facts, a disturbing yet plausible alternative begins to take shape. A meticulously orchestrated operation, perhaps executed by or on behalf of powerful elites, exploiting a system already riddled with vulnerabilities. Our aim now is not to declare a definitive alternative, but to demonstrate the logistical feasibility of such a plot, to explore how it could have been achieved based on the very failures and anomalies the official narrative struggles to explain. The logistical blueprint for such a conspiracy to silence Jeffrey Epstein reveals itself not as a complex web of improbable events, but as a chillingly efficient operation. At its apex would sit highly connected individuals of significant societal standing, figures who exert immense, far-reaching influence across finance, politics, and even international networks through established, albeit often opaque, channels such as lobbying, campaign contributions, corporate boards, privileged relationships, and strategically placed appointments to positions of authority. Their primary incentive would be a stark one: to prevent the catastrophic legal, financial, and reputational ruin that Epstein's potential testimony threatened to unleash upon them. Epstein's impending federal sex trafficking trial, posed an existential threat to this network. His black book and sworn testimonies contained brutal details that had the profound potential to implicate numerous high-profile associates, reaching into the highest echelons of global society. The unsealing of over 2,000 pages of damning documents the day before his death, guaranteeing intense media scrutiny and public implication, amplified this threat acutely. For these orchestrators, Epstein's continued existence as a potential witness or source of further revelations was an absolute non-negotiable imperative that demanded his permanent silence. His death served as the convenient and definitive end to this direct legal threat to all implicated parties. The chilling brilliance of this operation lies in its deceptive simplicity. It wouldn't demand the clandestine infiltration of a secure facility by external forces. Instead, it would leverage the very chaos and documented failures that were the hallmarks of MCC New York. The conspirators' first move wouldn't be to create new problems, but to shrewdly identify and capitalize on the pre-existing rot within the institution. MCC wasn't merely poorly managed, it was a crumbling infrastructure plagued by chronic understaffing, physical decay, and crucially a notoriously deficient security camera system. These weren't obstacles to overcome, they were the perfect environmental enablers for an unobserved act. The documented catastrophic disk failures of the Special Housing Unit's digital video recorder system, which rendered nearly all cameras in Epstein's tier inoperable for recording, would have been seen as a pre-existing blind spot of invaluable utility. The orchestrating elites, through strategic informal communications with senior officials within the Bureau of Prisons or Department of Justice, or by leveraging existing relationships and favors, would have ensured this known, critical malfunction remained unaddressed during the pivotal time frame. A state achieved either through a deprioritization directive or by simply applying pressure to prevent its immediate repair. Next would come the manipulation of human resources. The pervasive staffing shortages at MCC routinely forced correctional officers like Tova Noel and Michael Thomas into exhausting mandatory overtime shifts, leaving them susceptible and fatigued. Their demonstrated willingness to deliberately falsify official logs to conceal their dereliction of duty would have made them soft targets for compromise. The external assets of the orchestrators, perhaps former intelligence operatives, criminal facilitators, or specialized fixers with experience in suborning officials, would identify and approach these officers. Their role would not have been to commit a direct act of violence, but to engage in culpable negligence, to deliberately fail to perform required inmate checks for 8 consecutive hours, allowing the critical window for the act to unfold unseen. This would be secured through significant financial inducement or, if necessary, coercion derived from leverage vulnerabilities. Their documented behaviors of sleeping and browse the internet served as both cover and the very mechanism for this crucial lapse in oversight. A pivotal preparatory step would have been the calculated isolation of Jeffrey Epstein. This crucial maneuver would fall to administrative or supervisory staff within MCC, potentially an associate warden, or even the warden themselves. They would be influenced by directives issued through their chain of command, subtly shaped by the orchestrating elites network, or through promises of career advancement or other incentives. Despite an explicit institution-wide directive from MCC Psychology mandating that he needed to be housed with an appropriate cellmate due to suicide risk, his cellmate was conspicuously transferred out on August 9th, the day immediately preceding his death. This would not have been an administrative error. It would have been a deliberate decision, executed under specific influence, designed to ensure Epstein was entirely alone, thereby creating the necessary conditions for an unobserved event. With the environment meticulously prepared and direct oversight removed, the execution of the act itself could then proceed with disturbing straightforwardness, requiring minimal direct intervention. This was not a scenario demanding a team of assassins. Instead, it would have capitalized directly on the compromised internal environment. The death would have been a swift, decisive homicide, executed by a single, highly compromised internal staff member, either a correctional officer or, more plausibly given the need to effect incapacitation, a medical professional. A critical precursor would likely involve a fast-acting, untraceable substance to induce incapacitation, discreetly administered by a compromised medical staff member, a nurse or doctor, with privileged access to his cell. This would render Epstein unable to resist, thereby mitigating the risk of a prolonged struggle. However, even with incapacitation, some degree of resistance or the very act of restraint could account for anomalous injuries, such as contusions on his wrists, an abrasion on his left forearm, or deep muscle hemorrhaging in his left shoulder, which are not typical of an unresisted suicidal hanging. Following incapacitation, the homicide would be carried out. Forensic consultants, operating for the elites, would have provided precise guidance on staging the scene, the careful application of a common ligature like a torn bedsheet, the strategic positioning of the body to mimic a plausible partial hanging, and crucially, the minimization of any overtly obvious defensive wounds. The peculiar detail of the ligature being folded and hemmed, not cut, directly contradicting the testimony of prison staff who claimed to have cut it to free Epstein, speaks to a meticulous effort to control the post-mortem forensic narrative and undermines critical eyewitness accounts. Yet, the execution of the act would be merely the genesis of the operation. The true mastery of this alleged conspiracy would lie in the post-incident manipulation and comprehensive cover-up. The inaugural and most devastating act of concealment would have been the immediate removal of Epstein's body from the cell prior to the mandatory in situ photography. This egregious violation of prison protocol would fall to the initially responding compromised correctional officers, irrevocably destroying primary evidence and precluding any independent forensic verification of the scene. From this critical juncture, the levers of elite influence would be fully engaged. The swift declaration of suicide by the medical examiner, reportedly influenced by non-forensic factors, would serve to establish the official narrative. This influence would be exerted by high-level legal or political intermediaries connected to the elites, who would make specific informal requests or convey subtle expectations to the medical examiner's office to align their findings with a predetermined outcome. Subsequently, the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Department of Justice Office of the Inspector General, operating under what appears to be a limited scope, would focus their inquiries primarily on the negligence of low-level staff, who conveniently provided ideal scapegoats by falsifying their logs, rather than delving into the possibility of deeper criminality regarding Epstein's death. This strategic narrowing of investigation would be facilitated by influential figures within the DOJ or other government agencies who would advise on parameters or prioritize specific lines of inquiry, subtly guiding the narrative. The strategic suppression of critical DNA analysis results from the ligature, a vital piece of forensic evidence, would further compound the opacity, managed perhaps by compromised evidence technicians or officials overseeing forensic analysis. Concurrently, a carefully managed media narrative would quickly emerge, disseminated through public relations specialists or media contacts aligned with the elites, dismissing legitimate questions and expert dissenting opinions as mere conspiracy theory, thereby controlling public perception. The simplicity of this alleged conspiracy is precisely its most terrifying attribute. It would not be a complex, improbable feat. It would be the calculated exploitation of a demonstrably broken system, the subversion of compromised personnel, and an unyielding will to eliminate a profound threat. When all these disparate yet interconnected pieces align, it ceases to be a mere collection of anomalies. It becomes a blueprint for murder, meticulously disguised as an accident, executed in plain sight. Until a truly independent and transparent investigation addresses these profound and persistent questions, public trust in the integrity of our federal institutions and in the impartiality of justice will remain profoundly and justifiably eroded. This scenario, meticulously constructed from the very anomalies the official narrative dismisses, forces us to confront a chilling possibility. If such a coordinated subversion of a federal facility and its investigative aftermath could indeed occur, what does that truly reveal about the vulnerabilities within our systems of justice and accountability? And if the official story of Jeffrey Epstein's death is not the truth, then who truly holds the power to silence even the most notorious, and what remains hidden in the shadows of that silence? Thanks for listening. This was another Deep Dives.